Okay, let's go ahead and get at it. So good evening, as it is right now, and hopefully you'll get to watch this over the weekend. So let's go ahead and get at it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to pick up with competition and monopolies, and we're actually going to get back to monopolies here. Just really where we were Wednesday. What I'm going to do is I'm going to back up just a little bit in regard to price discrimination, and then we'll go forward from there. Just as a word to the wise, we will be doing some heavy lifting as far as graphs go. So, okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about price discrimination and just kind of reintroduce you to the topic. So, remember what price discrimination is. We don't treat all sellers the same. We're going to charge different sellers different prices, okay? And again, price discrimination is not possible in a competitive market because the buyers and sellers, no one of them has enough control, right? So if you remember, in a competitive market, everybody is a price taker. The price is the price is the price. Sellers, buyers, no one of them, because there's so many of them, no one of them really has the ability to kind of control the market. All right. Now, just a little bit about pricing. We spent a little bit of time talking about this, but you think about, just as kind of like a little story, we were talking about Progressive Field and how Major League Baseball, of course, they provide us the same game. And it doesn't matter whether we're really close to the field or way up in the nosebleed. Same thing with the Q, right, where the Cavaliers play basketball. Whether you're on the floor, remember, there's nothing better than good seats at a basketball game, right? Or you're up in the nosebleeds. The game is still the same. The difference, of course, is that we discriminate, right? And those that are willing to pay up front, right, to be on the floor or close to the field, they're going to pay a little bit more. And those that are in the nosebleeds, well, they're going to be able to pay, rather, a little bit less, right? So think of it that way. There are other ways in which we treat people differently, even in regard to sporting events. Those that are willing to pay early and pay a little bit less. If you're willing to buy season tickets, whether it's the good seats or the bad seats, you may be able to pay a little bit less if you buy in bulk. All right. 3 lessons about price discrimination. Number 1, it can maximize profit, so it's a good strategy, right? You can basically make sure that you get all of the consumers that you would want. You're finding them at their price point. Again, monopolies have the ability to do this. It takes a lot of research, but they have the ability to do it. So number 1, you can maximize your profit. So it is a rational strategy. All right. Number 2, it requires that you segregate your market. All right. Markets, again, this is called, when we segregate your market, you're doing it based on different types of consumers. So you're really segmenting them. It's no different than we find out who's willing to pay a high price for the best laundry detergent versus the low-grade laundry detergent. So trying to find out where they would be willing to pay. So it does take some homework. All right. And then 3, price discrimination actually can increase consumer welfare. All right. So, and we're going to show this through a couple of graphs. This is actually kind of where we left off a little bit. Where if you think about the different levels of consumers in terms of what they're willing to pay, you know, if you have somebody that really wants to watch a baseball game or really wants to watch a basketball game, but they can't afford being right up against the floor, well, at least there's access. I mean, they can go back into the nosebleeds and have some seats and be able to watch the game. Okay. So again, they're just really kind of three lessons from price discrimination. Number 1, it's rational. Number 2, you have to segregate your market based on consumer preferences. You have to do some research, in other words. And 3, it can actually increase public welfare. Okay, so what we're going to do now is talk a little bit about the analytics of price discrimination, all right? And we're going to do a little bit of graphing. Okay, so what we're going to do is really look at a monopoly in two different ways. Now, again, by the way, when we're talking about price discrimination, this is really the province of monopolies. This isn't really competitive firms. And then later on tonight, we're going to get into two different types of firms. Somewhere in the middle between competitive firms and monopoly firms. Okay, so essentially what we're going to do is look at a situation where what would happen if the monopoly could only charge one price. All right, so let's say we're just going to call this monopoly with one price. All right, so back to I was warming up tonight. I got to be very careful with the number of, I've only got one black marker here, so I have to be judicious with it. Okay, so this is our marginal revenue curve. All right, and then we're going to put in a demand curve. All right, all supposed to be straight lines. And again, with Tudor drawing, sometimes it doesn't always happen. All right, whoops. Okay, then we're going to take this one out. All right, this is our marginal cost line. Okay, and then we're going to plug in a monopoly price. Let's do that in brown. All right. Okay, so I'll abbreviate here a little bit. Your monopoly price. All right, and your quantity. And by the way, again, this is, price here, quantity here, right? Okay, so that's no different. Okay, but now what we need to do is shade in some areas, and I want to show you something here. Maybe we'll go with a little bit of red here for this top. All right. I'll give you some letters here in a minute. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, let's go with a little bit of lime green here for this area. All right, and then we're going to have this little area. Maybe we'll use some orange here. Add an orange marker right there, I guess. Okay. Okay. All right, so let's. Okay, and we used lime green for this. Now again, we're looking at it from the, we used red here. Okay, there we go. Now hopefully you'll be able to see this pretty easily. Okay, so again, this is a monopoly being able to charge just one price, right? And here's the price. Let me give you some letters, right? So we'll call that A, B, C, all right, D, and we're going to call that E, okay? All right, now, if the monopoly price is basically A out to B, right, that's the price, quantity that you're going to produce, right, it's right there. All right, so that's easy. I mean, that's something we've seen in just about every graph. But essentially, again, even monopolies they have costs, right? So their zone of profit, right, the M firm, the monopoly firm's profit is really A, B, C, D, right? So go ahead and get that down in your notes. Again, A, B, C, D, that's basically where their profit is, all right? But the untapped, in fact, I got to give you another point here. Let me call this F, okay? All right, the untapped consumer surplus. Now, by the way, I'm just kind of adding this term, and the reason I'm adding this, I'm going to show you another graph here where you'd want to tap them, right? You would want that money. But essentially, the monopoly firm's profit is just A, B, C, D. When you're only charging one price, you're still going to have some dead weight loss, okay? Now remember, when we were looking at it from a different perspective with the monopoly, we had it looking more like a triangle, but again, we still have to have some costs in here, so we're throwing that in. That's our horizontal line here. And again, on the exam, as you can imagine, you're going to do a lot of graph drawing, as I've warned you before. Okay, so, all right, the dead weight loss, right, is BCE. Now, admittedly, this is also untapped, right? You're not getting this, right? And another way to look at this is that this is total surplus, right? And since it's above the marginal cost curve, right, it's just what you, and it's also above the price line. Again, this is just, you're not going to get to take advantage of this. It is part of total surplus you're not going to take advantage of. But if we look at FBA, right, FBA, this is untapped consumer surplus. This is just revenue you're not going to get because you've decided to just charge one price. Now, how much of a loss is it? Okay, well, that's where the in-house economists, accountants, finance group, they get together and they kind of decide whether it's worth it. Okay, and maybe they want to keep, by the way, you're missing out here too. All right. Maybe they've made the decision that it's just not worth lowering their brand standard, their brand perception, that type of thing, so they're going to stay there, and that's fine. What we're just pointing out is that we're not commenting on how bad the decision was to price here and produce here. That's not that. We're just trying to show where the untapped consumer surplus would be with just one price. Okay, but one of the things that to kind of comment, or just really kind of remind you, along this demand curve, again, that's what the consumers would want. So that's a set of preferences for consumers. So again, you might have some consumers that would value it here, might value it here, but you're the monopoly, you're going to charge one price. And this is essentially your profit zone, right? It's all going to be above the marginal cost curve, okay? So, you know, one of the problems, of course, is that price discrimination, you know, we've mentioned that it's rational. You have to segregate your market, right? Market segmentation, decide who would be willing to pay what, and it can actually improve consumer welfare, right? But this last part, consumer welfare, you don't see this on this chart. So let's look at it, right, from a different perspective, okay? And I've got some examples on your outline. You think about movie tickets, right? Movie tickets, we certainly engage in price discrimination. The people that pay the most for movie tickets are always going to be your adults who aren't seniors. The people that are going to pay less are your children. Of course, the adult ones that pay. I always pay for my 8-year-old son to watch a movie, right? And the seniors, they're not going to pay anything, right? Maybe there are even coupons on top of that. Maybe you belong to a movie club, so you'll buy 10 movies and get to pay a discount there. So we do that all the time. Another great example, I think, is the airline industry, whereby there's first class, business class, regular class, or coach, or economy, or whatever you want to call it. But again, depending upon the day, the time of day, depending upon the time of year, the season, the destination, again, all that stuff could be different. Discount coupons, which could attach to any one of these services or goods, but even more just specifically, seniors sometimes get discounts, kids get discounts, retired versus working, that type of thing. Now in higher ed, we do this a lot. We price discriminate in higher education, right? Now at the public universities, we really don't do it a whole lot. The private liberal arts colleges, or really private universities in general, they do a lot of price discrimination. Not everybody's going to pay the same, all right? And it generally winds up in a couple of different circumstances where those who have financial need will pay less. Those who don't have financial need will pay more. Those who negotiate a little bit more might pay a little bit less, okay? Those who did well in high school might pay a little less. Okay, so liberal arts colleges do a lot. They're private universities, and they don't have to be just liberal arts colleges, do it a lot. Okay, now, the number one way, and this is what I want you to get in your notes, right? The number one way in which we engage in price discrimination is buying in bulk. If you're willing to buy a lot from us, you'll pay less on a per unit basis, right? So, just some examples there, all right? But nonetheless, I think it's a pretty good way to look at it. Okay, now, with that said, what I want to do is change this graph a little bit. And again, this is with just one price, right? So what I'm going to do now is put up a graph whereby monopoly engages in perfect price discrimination, right? And they can charge anybody anything. You're going to find that it's actually a much simpler graph. And I'm probably going to have to get rid of all this just to clean it up a little bit, right? The green doesn't look like what's come off there. Okay. All right, so this is actually a simpler graph. All right, this is still price, still quantity. I think we had our marginal cost curve in purple here. Okay, now, okay, let's say, all right, we know where our marginal cost curve is, but we would be willing to price anywhere up along here. All right, so, and this is just a little overkill, so I'm going to do it in pink and just match everything out. You know, you'd be willing to, I mean, just these, I mean, you're willing to price anywhere in here, and you're willing to produce at any point in there, right? So if you were to do it, let's just go ahead and fill in this whole zone, if you will. All right. Would be profit for the monopoly firm. So I'll just go A here, B here, and C here. All right. So what I want you to get down in your notes, right, is if a firm is willing to get away from one price and charge all sorts of prices for all sorts of consumers above, all right, above their marginal costs, you see a couple things here. Number one, right, there is no dead weight loss, and number two, there's no untapped consumer surplus. So let's get that down in our notes, right? Again, if you're willing as the firm to charge at all kinds of different prices, right? Meet the needs of every consumer, if you will. Sell out the queue, sell out progressive field, if you will. All right? Well, everything's profit. Everything above your marginal cost curve is profit. Now, again, we're also assuming you could meet demand in terms of production, but I think that's pretty easy to assume. Okay? Simpler graph if you're willing to engage in what we would call perfect price discrimination. Okay? Okay, so we'll leave that up for just a little bit. Okay. All right, now let's go ahead and look at public policy. And I kind of promised you that we would talk a little bit about some of the things that governments can do in regard to monopoly behavior. And we had mentioned this actually on a couple of different situations, but now we're actually going to talk about. Now, what I want you to do is get down to your notes, all right, the reality and then the two big problems. Okay, the reality is if we had decided, all right, we've already mentioned this before, if we had decided that competitive markets are the best way and the most efficient way to allocate resources, then we would also have to agree that monopolies are the least efficient way to allocate resources. Okay, so the big problem is that monopolies are grossly inefficient, right? The two problems is, number one, the quantity isn't what people want, right? And, you know, if in a perfect world, it'd be way out here in C, but, you know, all this stuff is probably going to be over here. I'm just using this graph just to kind of show you, all right? But, you know, we're using marginal cost as more or less the supply curve there. All right, so perfect elasticity of supply. You're willing to meet all the needs of consumers at whatever quote is, and I kind of was dropping these points down a little bit. But anyway, you get the idea. And number two, the price is generally too high for all consumers. So to kind of tie this together, in fact, I'll tell you what, we'll go ahead and use this graph, all right? The overwhelming majority of monopoly firms aren't going to engage in this. They're not going to get this far. They know it's rational. They know they need to segregate the market based on consumer preference, but they're probably not going to engage in a pricing structure that maximizes consumer welfare. Instead, what they're probably going to do is just stick to one price, right? So again, if you think about it, there is going to be a dead weight loss. There is going to be untapped consumer surplus, which would be above, I'll just do this, the monopoly price. Right, it kind of makes sense. And if I were to go ahead and plug in some, just my marker here. If I were to go ahead and say, that's A, let's call this C, let me call this E. We'll make that an E, all right? Just because I got C over here, we'll call that D. So, in most situations, right, the monopoly profit is really just going to be, let me get rid of that. So it's going to be that brown area, just to kind of, it's probably coming in black on your screen, but nonetheless, it would be AEDB, right? They're just not going to go that far and just find every single, because again, that will have a cost in and of itself. And admittedly, when we, before we made these alterations and we were just looking at the chart whereby a firm, right, is engaging in perfect price discrimination and finding a quantity and a price that meets every one of their consumers' needs. There is a cost to that too, okay? And think of it this way, just kind of an easy way. Think about going to the queue. As you know, I like basketball, right? It would be one thing to charge everybody the same and not have to change every single little ticket, right? There's a cost associated with reprinting tickets that have a little bit of different information. Maybe not a lot, but okay, you get the idea. Okay, so again, the two big problems. Number one, you don't get enough quantity to satisfy consumer demand because you're purposely moving it over here. And number two, the price is too high to allow for all consumers to get what they want. Okay, so let's talk about what government can do. Number one, they can enforce antitrust law. Okay, now antitrust law is just what it sounds like, antitrust. Trust is the old term we used to use to describe super mega monopoly power, right? Firms that just had so much control that it became abusive and damaging to consumers, all right? Now, this is different than too big to fail, although there are some commonalities, right? If you think about a firm that has all this kind of power, what happens if they fail? Are they too big to fail? That means government has to bail them out. This is a little bit different, but some of these firms could, in practice for our purposes, it's a little bit different, but in reality, some of these firms might be the same that we would consider too big to fail. Okay, now, essentially, there are two types of monopolies, right, that we would try to break up, right? Number one is an existing monopoly that's just got this kind of mega power, right? They got there, somehow they got there. Think about Amazon, right? Now, most people that do this kind of work for a living will tell you that Amazon is probably not sustainable with the level of power that they have. At some point, Jeff Bezos may be asked to break it up a little bit and have different companies and get in different, have different stocks associated with them, okay? I don't know at what point that'll happen, okay? Number two, all right, are firms that are about to merge, okay? And what I want to do is talk a little bit about, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this because I want to use some of this board to write some of this stuff down, okay? Because I find this stuff really, really quite interesting. Okay, I'm going to put that on there. All right, so again, there are two types of mergers. So number one, by the way, the two types of firms, one that have the mega power, right? And two, the second situation, condition rather, right, type of firm, is these are firms that are about to merge, right? So there are two types of mergers, all right? First is the horizontal merger. Okay, so think of two firms that are at the same level in the stream of commerce. All right, they do roughly the same thing. Classic example, this hasn't happened, but imagine Coke and Pepsi forming the same company. Think about how much power they would have in the cola industry, if you will. All right, it's just way too much power, right? I think everybody would agree with that. That's just way too much power. Okay, the other type, all right, which actually does exist a little bit, are vertical. Okay, vertical mergers. Imagine Coca-Cola buying all of its bottlers moving forward, right? Imagine gas companies, gasoline companies, oil companies owning all of their gas stations, right? So that is to say you're going up and down in the stream of commerce versus being at the same level. Okay. Now, it's not to say, by the way, that horizontal mergers haven't been allowed to take place. They have. That vertical mergers haven't been allowed to take place. They have, okay? The question is really whether we choose as a society or a government, if you will, to enforce antitrust law and not allow this to happen, or in the first condition, break that huge firm up, right? What is it that we're willing to do, all right? Now, a lot of this is very, very political, all right? Different presidents who lead different administrations have different ideas about antitrust law, sometimes allowing them to merge, sometimes not. Sometimes willing to get in and break up firms, sometimes not. It really just depends. And you know, if you really get into it, I think for the most part there are some generalizations we can make about the fact that maybe Republicans aren't willing to stop these types of mergers and aren't willing to break up firms, and the Democrats are the opposite. I don't think that bears out in real evidence. So I think both parties are willing to do some of it sometimes, and others not so much. Okay. Now, there are two statutes that I want you to know about. Let's go with a different color just for the heck of it. You probably studied these somewhere. The Sherman Act of 1890. That was the first statute that really gave the federal government the authority to break up trusts, or to break up really, really large firms. All right. And basically the standard is whether they have this dominant power, right? And to a certain degree, whether they're abusing that power, right? Where they're really manipulating prices to the point where they're hurting consumers. Okay. Now, if you remember, we've also talked in class about, well, what about the damage to workers? All right. And this being a new body of research, a new way of thinking about antitrust, that, yeah, it's one thing if we allow these big companies to charge whatever they want and hurt consumers, but what about what happens to the workers? All right. Remember, we used the term monopsony, right? All right. The idea is we have one firm actually in that market, and they're the only firm that can buy those types of employees. Maybe do they have the power, right? Remember, one of the things we mentioned is that most of the time what makes monopoly so powerful is they're able to reduce their costs. If it's a monopsony and they're only buying the only type of workers that are in that industry, they're able to depress wages as well. Okay, and then the Clayton Act. Oops. Of 1914, the Clayton Act of 1914. Okay, and essentially what this did is it actually gave private parties the ability to file lawsuits. So another way to look at it is the Sherman Act basically gave the federal government the authority. But let's say you're a firm and you're in that market and you've been hurt, right? So in other words, let's say Coke and Pepsi merge, the federal government lets them do it, all right, and you're a third company, right? Say RC Cola, some of you probably didn't remember that. RC Cola says, wait a minute, we're going to get hurt by that. All right? They're going to start dominating the market. All right? Or if you're a consumer group, then you can file that lawsuit. Okay. Now, admittedly, to kind of give you the other side of this, it is absolutely true that large firms, whether they start out as monopolies or if they're willing to merge, they can make their operations much more efficient. All right, they can choose to do that. All right, antitrust law sometimes forgets that. What we would hope, however, is that if a firm really had that kind of mega power, like an Amazon, or if two firms were thinking about merging, that if they were able to drive down costs that much, maybe they could drive down prices a little bit and help us all out as consumers. But maybe even if not that, driving down their costs in other ways other than wages, and then maybe if they're charging a higher price, maybe give some of that profit, right, back to workers in the form of wages. So if you're going to reduce your costs, maybe do it with the factories and distribution, things like that, but maybe giving some of your employees a raise, if you will. Okay, another thing that a government can do is regulate. So maybe don't break up the company, maybe don't prohibit two firms from merging, but decide what price they can charge. Okay? Now, if I were teaching this class in the 1970s, there would be a lot to talk about here. All right? Lots of industries were indeed heavily regulated by the federal government and sometimes the state governments. The federal government, for the most part, has really gotten out of that. All right, the deregulation movement that really started in the 1970s, even under President Jimmy Carter, it went, I'd say, on steroids during President Reagan. That's not a negative comment. It just had. In fact, I think most of it was probably very, very good. But basically, if a firm had that kind of power, the message to that company was like, okay, you can have all that power, but we're going to tell you what you're going to charge. Okay. Now, one of the most fascinating areas that I find, again, this merges intellectual property with antitrust, is the compulsory license. So let's say you're a firm and you've got this kind of power because of a patent or a copyright. It's almost always a patent, or a trademark, but again, it's almost always a patent. And you could theoretically charge whatever you want for your good, but that you had to do it, all right? That you didn't have a choice as to whether to license your intellectual property or not. You had to do it. And some governments actually go in one step further and say, not only do you have to license your intellectual property, but you have to do it at this price. Again, just something to think about, okay? Now, with that said, we don't do much of this. We do some of it at the state level with utilities, but we still really just do not do, we don't do much of it, okay? Now, there are generally two big problems associated with regulation. Is that generally it's hard to get the price down to the point where a firm would really stay a monopoly. So, if you're going to regulate prices where you think they ought to be, well, you're going to lower prices so much that the logic of cost curves is all kind of messed up. And essentially, you're going to force that company to lower the price, where you're going to have other firms that are willing to enter the market. So that's one of the bigger problems that you'll see. Okay, it's just really hard to get out of that. Okay, one of the other problems, of course, is that